I'd like to introduce speaker Joe, and I apologize if I misspell or mispronounce your last name, but Porostosky, Director of Facilities, Information and Technology Services at the Ohio State University. We're going to discuss the topic of the origin, evolution, and future of Ohio State's BIM Project Delivery Standards. And this is a really exciting topic, I think, in many regards, because there's a lot of efforts happening across not only the National Institute of Building Sciences, but other different universities and owners are driving a lot of these initiatives and standards. So love to hear a perspective from Joe. Joe, welcome up here and kick us off. Thank you. And if you don't mind, give him a brief introduction and then take it off.
Yeah, okay, so my name is Joe Porostosky, and my team at Ohio State, we manage a lot of data about our buildings and about our campus. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about that. What we also do is we manage a lot of our BIM initiatives at Ohio State. And we've kind of packaged all of those BIM initiatives into what we call the Buckeye BIM Initiative, because we want to make it sound cool. So that's our aim here. The Buckeye BIM Initiative is really three parts. One is the BIM for existing buildings. I'm going to talk about that super briefly. And then we're going to talk about BIM for design and construction. That's what I'm primarily going to talk about. And then BIM for planning operations and data analysis. We think about this as a continuum. We're building buildings, which is building our models. We're maintaining those buildings over the long term. We're integrating data from the design and construction process. And then we're operating our facilities over the long term in a model-based format. So when we started the Buckeye BIM Initiative, many years ago, and I'll talk about a timeline here in a second, we had this project objective, and it was to enhance planning and communication, resulting in improved quality and speed of decision making. Now, one of the things that you need to understand about my department is that we are a decision support organization. We help the university make better decisions more quickly. We have lots of data about a lot of different things about our facilities, and we're all about helping the entire organization make better decisions. And so when we're thinking about BIM and we're thinking about what we are trying to accomplish with all of our BIM initiatives, it was all about how do we help the organization make better decisions more quickly. There are a lot of cool uses of BIM, but we really don't try to use BIM in a cool way. That is not our intent. We're really trying to focus on the really most practical and useful uses of BIM, those that are going to help us drive decision making in better ways. And so that's really what we really are thinking about when we're thinking about different use cases. So when you think about our timeline, we've been doing BIM for a long time. This started back in 2008, 2009, when internally, we were managing floor plans in AutoCAD, right? And this goes back to just my team, that's all we did. We managed floor plans, managed space data. Really weren't thinking about design and construction even at the time. And we started having these conversations about maybe there's a better way to manage our space data, manage our floor plans. And we started hearing about the software called Revit, and we didn't really know what that was. And we had a colleague who introduced us to Brian Skirpak, actually, and he was working at a firm who was doing a lot with BIM and doing a lot with Revit early days. And he just started talking to us about what was possible with this, and just informal conversations. And that led us to starting the BIM for Existing Buildings initiative, which I said I'm not going to talk a ton about, but really what it was that we were going to transition all of our AutoCAD-based buildings, floor plans, in the medical center specifically, into Revit-based models. And so we did that. We kicked that off in 2011. And just fast forwarding, we finished converting our entire campus here just last couple of months, actually. So that process is complete, but that's part of it. That's kind of the background. But in 2012 is when we started getting really serious about talking about, well, maybe we're starting to see buildings being built using a BIM process. Maybe we should think about requiring that. Like, what would that mean as a university to require BIM to be used as a process? And then maybe, what would that mean to be requiring that as a handover? And so that started in 2012, and then that culminated in 2015 in our having a project delivery standard. And then in 2025, we've had it for 10 years essentially now. So we're going to talk through the entire process, then is really what I'm going to talk through next. So when we started this process of building our own models, this really began the conversation around this idea of an owner's model. Because we wanted to think about what does it mean to have our own kind of model, right? This is not a design intent model, it's not a work intent model, it's not even an as-built. It's what we like to call an as-maintained model. It's a model that we're going to maintain over the long term. And we had to answer a bunch of questions. What do we need in that model? What do we not need in that model? We had to ask a lot of internal stakeholders these types of questions. And really, some of the other questions, like what is going to support our planning efforts? What is going to support our operational efforts? But also, what can be reasonably maintained? There's only so much labor available on my team to maintain these models. So while there might be lots of things that we might want, what can we actually maintain? And so all these questions came in to be, we put all these questions together to come up with this idea of an owner's model or an as-maintained model. So now we get into this idea of BIM for design and construction. And one of the first things that we did was we did a BIM feasibility study. Because the senior leadership wanted to answer this question, is it worth it to us to actually have a BIM project delivery standard? Because a lot of us internally were saying, hey, look, we're starting to see models come in through these projects. We're just getting whatever we get. There's no contractual obligation for them to turn over models to us. But we're seeing projects come in using a BIM-enabled process, and the projects seem to go a lot better than what we had in the past. We think there'd be a value for us to require this. But of course, at a place like Ohio State, we have to bring consultants in to tell us that this is a good idea, okay? So that's the way that we do things. So we brought in a consultant, and they did some study, and they came up with a lot of things that we could have said too, but these are all the things that they said, right? And you can read for yourself, but a couple of things are, better construction documents, better data handover at the end of the project, just things that make sense, right? Things that we know now, but this was, a while ago. But the more important thing, and I know this is kind of small, they looked at 3 projects that we had just recently completed, and they said, look, if you would have used BIM from the very beginning of this project all the way through the end of the project, I shouldn't say the end of the project, actually through the entire building life cycle, you would have seen a cost avoidance of around 7%. We didn't like to use the word cost savings, but cost avoidance. Now, 7% is quite a bit at a place like Ohio State. It's a lot of money. We're never going to see 7%, but even if we saw 1 or 2%, that'd be a lot of money for us. And that was plenty of money on the table for leadership to say, okay, that's great. I think that makes sense for us to go ahead and proceed with developing a project delivery standard. And so then we embarked on putting out an RFP and looking at different, having different consultants say, hey, we can do this for you. Full disclosure, Brian's firm actually won that one also, along with another firm. I'm just being honest here, what's happened here. But I've worked with Brian for a long time, I guess is what I'm trying to tell you. So this is the beginning of developing the BIM Project Delivery Standard. Now, a project delivery standard from our perspective can really answer 2 things. One is how a project is going to be executed, kind of the nuts and bolts, and then what deliverables are going to be, or how the deliverables themselves are going to be formatted. And at Ohio State, we're not prescriptive about how the project is going to be kind of, how to run a project, because we work with tons of different teams, tons of different companies. We know every project team is going to have a different way of doing it, and we're not going to micromanage the project team, especially from a BIM perspective. We're almost entirely focused on the actual turnover documents themselves. And so how did we actually then develop the actual project delivery standard? So first of all, kind of setting up the scope. That was the RFP process. That's kind of like setting up how we're going to do this. The big pieces of this were the discover and the generate phase. And this is over a year's long process. This was bringing in our consultants and them doing a complete deep dive into the organization. This was them looking at how did we do projects today? What was working? What was not working? How does data move through the organization from a project perspective? What are our workflows? Doing focus groups and asking what was working, what's working for you, what's painful. Doing individual interviews, studying personas of different individuals. Understanding where data sits in an organization. And from all of that research came the actual generate phase, which is the actual documentation phase, which is the actual standard itself. And then the execution phase, which is what I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is the actual implementation plan that we put together. And then we have this analyze phase, which is we're going to continue looking at the standard over time to improve it over the years. Now back to that year-long process of understanding the current environment, a lot of it was trying to make sure that we understood what do we need and when do we need it? What's painful, what's working? And part of this, the benefit of this stage was making sure that we really understood the problems that people were having and took time to document those things so that when we got to the actual final result and we were going to put out the standard and we knew that the expectations for a lot of people were going to change, that they understood that we're trying to solve for problems that they had, and that they bought into the final result. They knew that, hey, sometimes there's going to be a little extra work for you potentially, but they bought into it because they knew we were solving for problems that they had actually communicated to us. Here's some examples of some of the things that we discovered. Here's one of the data diagrams that the consultants developed for us. It was kind of a mess, right? Like this is the way that the data kind of flowed through our organization from when a project came in. And we wanted to solve for some of these problems. Like we needed to make sure the data could actually move a little more smoothly when a project came in at the end of, when the data came in at the end of a project, right? And so this is an example of some of that data that was developed for us. Or the facilities information matrix. We wanted to understand exactly every piece of data associated with our buildings and our facilities. Which systems are they in? How are they used? Who's allowed to access them? How are they updated? And this gave us a better view into the kinds of data that we might want to be interested in collecting and capturing during the design and construction process. And then additionally, we want to understand what are the outcomes that we wanted to see then from a BIM project delivery standard. I'm just going to touch on a couple of the ones here in red. How can BIM reduce the total cost of ownership in operations? We want to see some practical benefits from this standard. Or how are we going to actually use the standard to actually get data from the turnover process into our existing and future technologies? And then less actually exciting, how are we going to actually update our contractual obligations so we can do what we want to do, which is super important, right? Like there's a lot of changes we had to make this all work. So what is our standard then? So we went through this process of developing it. What is our actual outcome? Now our standard itself is actually relatively simple. It's actually less than 25 pages. It includes some use cases up front. This is the kinds of things we want you to do with BIM. Again, we're not super prescriptive on how you do it, but we do tell you this is the kinds of things we want you to do with BIM. And so that's how we start with it. And then we talk about here's the different types of project participants that should be involved. But then we get into the meat of it for us, which is here's the deliverables. And this is specifically what we're looking for at the end of the project. And here's how we want you to develop them. And then we kind of have some, end of the glossary and that kind of thing. If you're interested in all the kind of details here, all these documents and all that is all available at go.osu.edu/BuckeyeBIM, and you'll see all these documents. So what are the deliverables? The first major deliverable which is due at the beginning of the design, when all the design partners are on board, and then also when all the contracting partners are on board, is the BIM execution plan. And this is just a Word document that you fill out. Again, it's not super long. That allows both of those teams to communicate with us how they intend to run the project. So it's things like the information, project information, the schedule, how they're going to meet the BIM project goals, who the project participants are and how we can contact them, information about how they're going to collaborate, what software they're using, what versions of software, how they're going to meet. Talk about the model element table here in a second. And then it gets into a little more technical things around the coordinate systems, how the model's structured, and some elevation information, how they're going to name those things. Part of this is to make sure that they understand the standard itself. Like, part of the things that are in here is to make sure that they're communicating with us, that they understand what's going on. But it's also to make sure that the design team and the construction team are communicating with each other too. That they have a plan to ensure that they're working together throughout the project. And that's part of what we intend to do with the BIM execution plan. It's a communication tool. And that's a big part of it. Now, we use LOD to help communicate to the project teams how we want the model to get developed. And part of that then is the LOD matrix. And so this is just a big spreadsheet, and it says, for this particular element, please develop it to this level. And you can see this here. And so the design team is going to fill this out and then fill that back out to us, or give it back to us. It allows them to communicate to us who's going to be the MEA for these different elements. And then also you see all the way to the right, we have a column that says asset tag. That allows us to tell them these particular assets are ones that we are going to want asset information about. And so please make sure that you're adding additional information to those, because we are going to ask you for information about that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But this allows us to communicate with them. Here are the pieces that we want graphical information about, and here are the pieces of assets that we want additional textual information about. Okay, so that's the BIM execution plan, but then we get towards the end of the project and we get towards the rest of the turnover documentation. And so the first thing we get and we ask for about 2 to 4 months prior to occupancy is what we call the interim conformed design intent, architectural, and structural BIM submittal. So this is interim, obviously. It's a little early. It's not. The models aren't what we consider record sets. They're not done yet, but we are expecting that the models are being conformed throughout all of construction. This is something we set up front. Obviously, this should be normal. These models should be kept up to date in any good project delivery process. But we want to make sure that expectation is set, because we're going to take these things a little bit early, and these are the ones that become our owner models. So we're going to put these through what we call a BIM to BIM process. We're going to clean them up. We're going to format them similarly to the way that we've built our CAD to BIM models internally, and those become the models that we're going to use to manage our facilities long term, because we have to have these into our systems before occupancy. This drives a lot of our space management, our work management, our financial systems, our asset management systems, and those all have to be done and ready to go before the building is occupied. And then our record set is due usually within 180 days after the building is occupied, and so that's the full set of discipline models. And then we also have our asset worksheet, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, we do have some expectations around how the buildings are modeled. We don't get super specific about our Revit expectations around that, but we do have some expectations around how rooms and spaces are developed, things around how all of the elements need to be hosted to approved floor levels, which we actually do mandate. We don't allow any typicals or prototypes to be used. Everything has to be modeled using clear and descriptive family names, avoiding families that were not created in Revit. We don't like the use of model in place families pretty much at all. And we want all demolished things to be removed. We have a couple other things too, but these things just simplify our life. It takes less time for us to clean up models to bring into our world, and it just makes it a little easier for us to manage these models long term. Now, from an asset data perspective, this is an area in which we continue to refine this. I'll mention this a couple more times because it's kind of a hard thing for us to get quite right. But we take, right at 3D coordination, we take the, we go to the AE and we have a plugin that we've written, and we give them the plugin. We say, we want you to take all that asset data we asked you to collect up to this point, run this plugin, and it's going to give us an Excel spreadsheet. We're going to take that Excel spreadsheet, and internally we're going to go to our internal CMMS team. They're going to do a little data scrubbing with it, and we're going to pass that off to our contractor. Contractor is then going to add a lot more information as they install equipment, like warranty information, make, model, serial number, and then at occupancy they're going to pass that back to us, and we're going to load it into our CMMS. And that works generally okay. It's not perfect, but it's okay. That's kind of how we do, how we handle our asset data workflow today. Okay, that's our standard. But one thing that we realized when we were putting this together 10 years ago is we saw a number of other owners who had standards. They were really good standards, but where we saw some of them stumble was the implementation stage. They just didn't have a good sense of how they were going to do it. And so one of the things that we asked our consultants to do was, can you please help us develop an implementation plan? How are we going to actually put this thing into place? And so they put a plan together that focused on people, technology, and process. And the first piece of this was the people piece. And a lot of this was around training initially. And you gotta imagine, like, this is over 10 years ago now, and a lot of it was, what is even BIM? Like, training our internal staff on BIM basics. And then also, what is the actual execution plan? Like, teach me to read an execution plan. Also, if you're looking at an RFQ and RFP, we've got to look at those differently. We have to understand that we're looking at something a little, if we're gonna assess these firms for their ability to meet our expectations, we have to be able to read these things differently, right? So how do we read these RFQ, RFPs correctly so that we can make sure they can actually meet our expectations? One of the other things we did is we held a big AC town hall where we invited a lot of our current partners and said, this is what we're doing. We're putting out a new standard and we want you to be involved, but we want you to know what we're doing and why we did it, how we developed it, and most importantly, what we're going to do with all this stuff we're asking you to give us. We're not just going to ask for all these deliverables and then just put them on a shelf somewhere. We want you to know that we have a plan, that we actually are capable of using this data, we're capable of using these models. We're not just asking you to do busy work just to do busy work. And so that was a huge part of our intent, was to make sure that the entire community that was going to be expected to meet our expectations, they knew what we were going to do with this. And then lastly, from a people perspective, while we called it a different title at the time, we identified an additional person that we wanted to hire, which was this idea of a closeout coordinator. And this person would be focused on helping set expectations at the very beginning of the project, that would say, this is what we're going to be expecting from you at the end of the project, and taking that responsibility away from the PMs, because the PMs are really focused on the project, and then at the end of the project, they kind of want to move on to the next project. They don't really want to focus on the closeout piece. And then at the end of the project, the closeout coordinator is really just focused on ensuring we're getting all the stuff we want at the end of the project. This was a huge success for us. This continues to be a very good role for us to have, and really helped us to ensure that we were getting everything we needed from these projects. From a process perspective, we treated the first number of these BIM projects as kind of pilot projects. We learned a ton from them and made a lot of revisions to our PDS early on. Those first couple of years, there was a lot of changes. We've also made a lot of changes to our asset data over the first couple of years, especially the way that we did that process. We continue to do that too. And we continue to adjust the way that we kind of handle our GIS integration. So how do we move from BIM into GIS? Now our PDS, as I mentioned, has changed a lot over the years. With some feedback from the AE community, Originally, we only had our LED matrix going down to uniform at level 3, which is actually not very detailed. It doesn't give you much. And they said, well, we don't really know how much you really want us to model here. Could you go down to uniform at level 4? And that's where we had to really put together a pretty large spreadsheet to do that. And so we did that. That was super helpful. We removed the use of LED level 500. That really wasn't giving us much. It was actually adding a lot more confusion than anything else. We've made a lot of changes, as I've mentioned, to the asset worksheet and the way that we turn over asset data. We've developed a lot of tools and also rule sets for what we call the OSU BIM PDS tools, which has been very helpful to help others, help the AE community meet our expectations. Additionally, our standard is only required to be used on projects over $4 million. We've never changed that number, but you can imagine 10 years ago, $4 million bought you a certain amount of things, and today $4 million does not buy you anywhere near as much. It's reduced the amount of, you can imagine that what we've done is we've actually reduced the size of projects that it's required on, which is good. But even now, there are a number of internally PMs that say, look, I don't have to use the standard, but I'd really like to use the standard on projects that are smaller than $4 million. But it's a little too heavy for that. And so we've developed a kind of what we call a BIM light version of it. And so for PMs who choose to use that, there's a different version of this that they can use on smaller projects. And then one other thing is that we've had to, for really large projects, we found that we've had to mandate that the Revit version on these projects gets updated on a regular cadence because we found that sometimes they just leave it as the version they started with, and that caused a lot of downstream problems for us. Additionally, we've also had to put some language in there about getting prior approval if they're going to use a non-Revit software version on the project, which usually means we're not going to approve it. So, but we do have a way to kind of work around that if necessary. Also, a good number of years ago, we started requiring Autodesk Construction Cloud to be used in all of our projects. We don't actually have the hub ourselves. We require them to have the hub, and then we get joined to it. We get required to be invited to it. We have some expectations around how that works and how often they publish and those types of things. This has been a pretty big game changer for us. Allows us to be much more involved with the project, have a lot better collaboration, and all around, it just makes the project run significantly more smoothly for us. From a technology perspective, we use Autodesk Model Checker tools, and we've written some customized rules for that allows us to communicate a little bit better to the project teams. This is what we're expecting to see. Please run these tool checks and pass them back to us so we can see if we're on the same page. That's really helpful, and just again, it doesn't check everything in the standard, but allows us to at least make sure we're on the same page. We've already talked about the asset exporter tool, and we're always looking for a kind of a way to have some sort of BIM middleware software that allows us to connect operationally. We haven't really gotten there yet on that, but it's something that we continue to think about. And then from a contract perspective, as I mentioned, it's something we've had to deal with. We've had to talk about fee schedules early on. We've had to make changes to our RFP and RFQ to ask pertinent questions to ensure that they can actually meet our expectations. We've had to change our building design standards to ensure that it refers to our BIM standards. We've had to make changes to our spec documents after a couple of years and we realized that it wasn't appropriately referencing our documents. So there's just, there's a lot of those things that had to get changed internally to ensure that this all worked. Okay, so we did all that, but what was the point? So how did this actually get used? And I'm not going to be able to talk about all the things we do internally with this. I'm just going to talk very briefly about how this actually has made a difference at Ohio State for us internally. And one thing I'll just mention is that we have to then manage all these models. I mentioned already that when we get these models, they go through what we call a BIM to BIM process. We have to clean them up a bit because we've developed a lot of models internally that we've converted from AutoCAD to Revit. Now we've received around 55 buildings through through the BIM PDS over the last 10 years. And so these buildings, we have everything, right? We have every discipline. They're very complete models. But we have a total of around 700 buildings if you count all of the CAD to BIM buildings too. So we have a very large portfolio of Revit-based buildings that we manage. And we have to manage ongoing updates to all these buildings too. And so we internally use BIM 360 to manage our entire suite of buildings. We use BIM Collaborate Pro internally. We also interact with lots of other departments within the university who manage their own models. Maybe they have a furniture model or an equipment model that they actually interact with our architectural models. So we have a pretty complex environment internally from a Revit perspective. And so for most of you who are already working in this environment, you understand, the nice part about this is it comes along with a web environment that allows the average user who doesn't understand Revit to interact with our models. Pretty big deal for us as an owner and for our average user, folks in the field, to actually get around in our models and not understand Revit. And it's pretty helpful. And so this is a big deal for us, be able to measure our models, those types of things. The big thing for us is we have a tool called BIM Portal, which is, if you're familiar, it's just Imagine It Clarity. And this allows us to automate a lot of our work. That's really nice. But for us, as an owner, it allows us to take all of our models, all 700 of them, shove them into a database, and do a lot of really interesting things from a data perspective. That's really much more interesting to us. The automation stuff is really nice. It saves us time. But we're really looking at the data side of things. So obviously here I can look at how many doors are in a particular single building, but what I'm much more interested about doing is I want to look at things at a macro level. So for instance, we had a request to know what's the total amount of exterior square footage of your windows on all the buildings in Columbus's campus, which is our main campus. So we were able to do that because we had loaded all of our buildings on Columbus campus into the system, something that would have been relatively impossible to do if we did not have all of our buildings in Revit and if they had not all been loaded into this database. And so that's something we could easily do. Pretty interesting to do. In addition, we have a system called Foscore working with a consultant on. It's kind of a deferred maintenance software, but it also has a suitability tool in there. I don't know anything about suitability, so don't ask me about that, but it's kind of assessing the suitability of a particular space. What they wanted to know was, for every particular room for your entire university, we want to know these things. You can see the list up there, okay? And what was fascinating is because we had loaded all this stuff into this system, we could do that. Unique identifier room perimeter, room door count. We know how many doors are in a room. The next one is how many of those doors touch a circulation space. We know that because this system is also connected to our space information system, which classifies every room. So now we've got those things connected. And then they wanted these things called room squareness and room perimeter efficiency, just some math. So, and so the nice part is we have these models that are constantly being loaded up into this BIM portal, which are constantly being connected over to this other system, the suitability space, constantly being connected to our space information system. We have this data ecosystem that is occurring at Ohio State because we are a fully BIM environment, and it's really allowing us to do things from a data perspective that are pretty fascinating. And we're really just starting to understand the kinds of work we can do because the fact that we are operating kind of at a higher level with having all of our buildings fully in a BIM environment. One of the things that we're doing even more aggressively now is moving from BIM into GIS. This allows us to look at multiple buildings at one time. This is just a small segment of our campus. You can see here 2 buildings right next to each other. And then also looking at them 3-dimensionally. One of the challenges we have here is that there's only so far you can go with this when you start running into performance problems. But we continue to try to figure out how to manage that more effectively. So I'm going to start wrapping up here with just some lessons that we've learned over the years of doing BIM and thinking about BIM for design and construction. Keeping in mind that we're a large owner, we've been doing this for a long time, and we have a lot of buildings that we're trying to manage for a long time. A lot of it comes down to proper planning and focus. What do you really want to, when we think about it as an owner, is like, what do we want to manage? What do we want to model? What is really important for us to model? What is actually going to be used for planning and operations? Sometimes owners will ask for everything, and I'm sure some of you may a lot of you interact with owners, and if they're less sophisticated, I guess, they just may say, well, just give me the model, like just give me everything, whatever you got. But what is actually important to be for the owner? Like what do they actually need to actually operate the facility long term? And what can they actually reasonably maintain? What is the best ROI for the organization? And from our perspective, the whole idea of focus is to keep it simple. We really want to keep our standards simple. One of the things that we talked to our consultants about when we were developing this is that because they were a combination of an AE and a C, we said, you might have to deal with this standard at some point. So please don't make something that's so complex that you don't want to deal with it, and so complex that we don't want to deal with it either. So it has to be simple enough that it's valuable to us, but also useful enough that everybody else wants to actually deal with it. So that's important for us too. Keeping it simple, keeping it focused. Effective training and processes is important too. We have highly effective, very well documented and straightforward processes for a lot of the work we do and how we actually accomplish them. When we're dealing with things at our scope, it just has to be well documented, has to be well developed. But also training has been super important to us. Making sure that we're training our staff effectively, especially early on. We brought in a lot of external trainers to make sure we understood how to do Revit effectively. Now we are pretty proficient in that, and we do a lot of our own training. So if we have all these models and we have all this good material, we help the rest of the university know how to use Revit, right? Because we don't want to just leave the stuff on the shelf. And you know, here in a couple hours, we're going to hear some more about how to do training well, right? That's one of our talks today. So I think that's important, is that we don't want to just, we want to make sure that the university can use all this good data that we're getting from the design and construction process effectively. We're always continually improving. We're constantly looking at our standard, making sure it works. We're constantly getting feedback from our AE and C partners and from internally. We're trying to always make sure our turnover process, which can always get better, is getting better. Our big thing is making sure everything is highly standardized across the board, where we have, everything is very, very standardized in our models. Obviously, the project delivery standard is a standard itself. But that allows us then to automate a lot of our work. If we don't have everything highly standardized, it's very hard to automate things. We have a whole set of our own plugins that we've built that helped us with our CAD to BIM process, with our BIM to BIM process, and just with managing our models every day. And we use a lot of other tools too that help us to manage our work. And then just partnering and collaborating. Internally, we collaborate extensively with our internal customers, making sure we understand what they want and what they need. But also externally, we've worked with lots of great partners over the years to ensure that we fill in our knowledge gaps. We don't know everything, so how do we actually ensure that we're doing the right things and also progressing what we need to know to do our work better? And then lastly, I'll just finish with where we're going. Some of the biggest areas that we continue to struggle with, things that we're trying to figure out, is how do we improve the asset data gathering piece and that turnover piece. That handover part is always still it's a little hard for us. We have a lot of areas that we want to continue to improve on that. We have a lot of ideas and areas where every year we try to get a little bit better. And we have a couple other things that we're working on that, but that's an area that we continue to work on. We need to transition from BIM 360 to Autodesk Construction Cloud, which for some of you are like, well, yeah, you just finish one project and the next one you'll just switch over to ACC. We don't have that ability. We have 700 projects in BIM 360, and we have to manually move all of those over to ACC at some point. So for us, that's like a big project, and that's something that we have to work on over the next couple of years. We want to continue to expand how we use the BIM data that we have and to drive decision making. That's a real big area of focus for us. And then we also want to continue to improve the transition of data between BIM and GIS. That's going to be a big area of continued growth for us. We are huge users of GIS at Ohio State, and that's an area that we have a lot of opportunities in the future for us. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. That was really excellent. And by the way, I have a question right away, if I can start and kick this off. Apologies. So obviously, you've made some significant investments in this, and sometimes owners are hesitant to do that, right? Or especially ones that are doing large campus projects and understanding the value proposition here. So how do you, I think you shared some great examples early on, like, hey, what are the real potential savings here? Were those from a perspective of project design and delivery, or have you also factored in the value proposition of what it is? What's the value proposition of you collecting all this information for operations and planning?
Yeah, so those dollar numbers you saw at the beginning, those are based on industry standards, first of all, but those go through the entire life cycle of a building. So that's going to talk about operating the facility also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right.
Um, Hi. So I work at, I'm an honor to at Intel, and a discussion that we have a lot lately. I'm curious to see you talk about all of the cost cut. I mean the return of investment. How do you see, and knowing that you went from not having a lot of standard, you went through all of that process of developing everything. How did you drive the cost in terms of the BIM at a design level and a construction level requiring BIM? Did you see a cost?
So did we see a
Increase?
cost to us for requiring BIM?
Yes.
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And here's the thing. We were already, most of our large projects were already delivering their projects using a BIM-enabled process. So it wasn't as if what we were expecting them to do was something they were not already doing by the time we put the standard in place 10 years ago. So our large projects, okay? What we were asking them to do oftentimes was just, making sure they were turning over documents in maybe a slightly different way or a little more standardized way than they were doing before. I'm not going to say that every team didn't push back a little bit on this, okay? We had some that were like, I'm not using BIM right now, and I have a couple of examples of that. But there weren't that many. We never got told that we're going to charge you more for this. Okay, that never happened. They're never like you're getting charged more because we're going to give you BIM. It just didn't happen. Did it happen? I mean, maybe, but every firm, like at the RFP stage, they would have all had to have been saying that we're just like everyone was charging us more or something, and we just didn't know it. Like, it wasn't like a very like clear, we're going to charge you a ton more for BIM, because everyone was doing it. These were large projects, large complex projects, in which the only reasonable way to actually deliver the project in a great way was going to be using BIM to begin with. Really, when you get towards like the $4 million range, that $4 to $10 million range, especially in early days. Yeah, probably those in early days would probably, those were probably like, this is going to be a little bit tough. And we definitely got more pushback in some of the subs, which wasn't our problem, because that was like the AE's problem to deal with. Like, you deal with your subs, it's not our problem. So, and we actually had a question in our RFPs, like, how are you going to deal with it if your subs don't do BIM? Like, that was literally the question. And so sometimes they had to remodel work before they get turned over to us, and that's just but that's not a problem today. Those were problems in the first 2 or 3 years of the standard. Today we don't have those issues anymore.
Okay, can I just a follow up on there, because you're doing the distinction between the design and the subs. Are you focusing BIM standard and for your record document at the end from the designer or from the construction and the subs?
Okay, yeah, good point. We take all of our documents from the AE side of the house. We don't take anything from the contractor.
Okay.
So yeah, and that's different. Some owners take from both sides. Some only take from the contractor. We don't take anything. I shouldn't say we don't take anything. That's not the right word. When it comes to when we say the record set for Ohio State, and I should really define this because some people define that differently too. I don't really know why, but that's just from the AE side. There are some documents we take from the contractor. It's just for the record set that Ohio State considers as the legal documents that we have turned over to us. It's only from the AE side. That's what becomes our honor models. It's just we don't need the level of detail that we would get from the contractor. So when I say conformed, we mean that the contractor needs to be having there needs to be continued communication with the AE during the construction to keep those AE models up to date at the level of detail that we've defined in the LOD matrix, so that when we get that model, it is actually accurate to what's happened in the field.
So do you have also requirements then from the AE to provide a conformed set as an as-built that's fairly clearly defined and documented?
Yes, that is the point. That is the point. So the AE is, when I say the interim conformed architectural and structural model, we're expecting that model to be conformed during construction. Okay, so and then the record set is the fully conformed model within 180 days after the project is complete, or occupancy, I should say. Yeah. So yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Oh, yep. All right. Well,
Thank you.
We got to keep this on track. Thank you, Joe. Pretty round of applause.